He destroyed Adolf Hitler. When everybody wanted to make peace with him, he thought, we're going to kill him.
I'm sitting here with Dr. Larry Arnn, who's a remarkable man, president of Hillsdale College. I asked Larry if he would do a lecture on Churchill.
In the formative years of his life, he's fighting and he's writing. There's nothing more exhilarating than to be fired upon without effect. Churchill had not yet become the greatest man in the world. The First World War, he was disgraced. The only solution to the problems we're facing today are in teaching and learning. When you do something disgraceful, then you write a whole lot to explain it. We will not repeat the mistakes of the past. We will make new mistakes. I will form a government by nightfall.
Why wouldn't a cynic say, well, really what you're doing is just advocating for your position?
And that's a huge moral question, and it comes up all the time. How do you win your wars in a way so you remain what you are? If you ask somebody a fundamental question, make a case. You know, Hitler is looming now. What is our aim? It is victory at all costs.
And will still say, this was their fighting power.
Welcome to this online course about Winston Churchill as part of the curriculum of the Peterson Academy. My name is Larry Arnn. I work at Hillsdale College. I am here because, like almost everybody else, I am charmed by Jordan Peterson, and to some small extent, dominated by him. If you meet him, which I hope everybody gets a chance to do, you'll find out that he analyzes you. And my particular way of dealing with him is to analyze him back. But I won't do that during this course because that might be too much. So Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill died in 1965, 60 years ago, round numbers. Why is he of any interest? I'll try to explain that. There's a reason in principle why he and everyone like him is of interest. And I'm going to talk about that first, and I fear that might be boring because it involves a bunch of arguments about the nature of human beings. Maybe they won't be. I don't know. I don't find them so anyway. And then I'll tell some stories about him that tell you what kind of guy he was, because he was a very remarkable human being. You don't have to like him or approve of him or agree with him to think that. If you just know about him, you'll go, wow, look at that. So what is that argument? It's an argument about what statesmen do. They do something that we all do most of the time. I'm going to make a classical argument to you. Apart from Churchill and some other things, I teach Aristotle at Hillsdale College, and that's the greatest dang thing there is. And so Aristotle's good at explaining what's going on in us, what's going on in our souls. He's the classical Jordan Peterson. And our mental weather, you might say, is mostly made up of making choices. Now, there's a higher thing than making choices, and that's figuring out something that's always true, things that never change. That's the highest kind of knowledge. But, you know, we don't use that all the time. And the reason is we're always busy figuring out what to do. Like some of you in the audience here, I know you made a trip to come here. That's a pain. You chose it. There were disadvantages. You had to give up something to come here because you couldn't be doing whatever else you'd be doing at that time. You made a comparison about the good, about what the best thing is. But the best thing is not enough to decide. You also had to make a choice about the obstacles. And they're many, right? Hard to get here. Is it worth it? What do I give up? What's going on when we make choices are very significant for us. According to Aristotle, they're more important than actions in forming our characters. And our character is something we make by making choices over and over and over again. And if we make them badly, and we're resolute about it, and particularly talented, we can become Adolf Hitler. Not many people actually do that. But if we make them resolutely and we're really good at it, and we make them in the right way, we can become superior people, splendid people. And it's our choosing that makes that. Human freedom lies in that fact, according to Aristotle. Well, we need to be good at that, right? And Aristotle says in Book 6, Chapter 2 of the Nicomachean Ethics, one of the greatest books ever written, he says that if you want to learn how to do that, study people who have the reputation for doing it well. And then he names an example, Pericles, a statesman. And he names that example because Pericles is like all statesmen. They make big choices that involve all of us in public. And they're just like us. They don't know the future any better than we do. And they somehow seem to be gifted at that. And studying examples is a great way to get better at that. Experience is the really best way to get good at that. Turns out experience is costly. Takes a lot of time. And also you make a lot of mistakes. So if you can learn faster, it's better to do it. And you do that by studying other people who make choices, especially those who make choices with and for us in public life. So the study of statesmanship is important to getting good at forming your character. Now, what makes choices hard is not just it's hard to know what the good is, what the best thing is. Aristotle says we actually always have a sense of that. If we didn't have a sense of it, we wouldn't be able to talk. And I won't go through all of that argument except to say that this is a bottle. There are several different examples of bottles in this room, and yet we always recognize the bottle. That's why we can use common nouns, and that's why we can talk. But what do we recognize about the bottle? We recognize its essence, or its being, or its good. It's seeing the good that makes us able to do the one thing that only human beings do, which is talk. We have grandchildren near us now, and I just love that. Also, they go home at night and don't keep us up. But they're learning to talk, and they long to do that. And the 18-month-old is getting pretty good at it now, and that means she won't shut up. And we don't want her to, because it's just like a plant growing. They want to grow, right? Well, this is a drive in us, a fundamental drive. It's the unique drive to us. And so we see good all the time. We think it's controversial. No, we name it every time we use a common noun. But the good is not enough, because you can't usually do just the good thing, because the goods are in conflict with each other. And you typically have to do your best, which means accepting something less than the best good, or accepting something less than the worst evil. And that's what we call prudential or practical judgment. That's where our mental weather is all the time. Now, zoom that up from our little things, my little things, say, I had to make a decision whether to do this course. I do online courses for Hillsdale College, for which I am responsible. But I do this because I'm captivated by Jordan Peterson. And also, I love to talk about Winston Churchill. So there was a good there that I was pursuing. And the obstacle was getting down here to Miami to do it. Worth it, I think. So there's an example there for us. Of course, what statesmen do is very consequential and matter to everybody. On the biggest scale, they matter to everybody in the world. And so it's not just a plotting the future and deciding the state of the world. it's also an education to study statesmen and why they do it. Now, because choices hinge on the good, but also necessity presented by circumstances, it means to study choices, means studying the circumstances. And that means you got to get into history. To know whether Winston Churchill was right about any particular thing, first of all, it's always a big argument, because there are large numbers of people who think he was wrong about every single thing he did, and there are a few people who think that he was wrong about all of them. But he was certainly wrong sometimes, according to my lights and according to his. And you have to know the circumstances. So you study that to learn. I mean, you study it because it matters, because if you're a citizen, it's like plotting your own life and everybody else's. But you also study it to learn how to be better. And that's a very high calling and great. Most of you in the audience here are young. That means your characters matter very much. And they're still forming, too. So you can, how you live your life, one of Aristotle's doctrine is you are what you do. And especially you are what you choose to do. And as I said before, that's more important than actions we take. Because it's that moment of choice when the options are in front of you. He even goes further and says that the decisive thing about whether choices are good or not is for the sake of what you make them. You can see, like courage is the first virtue discussed in the ethics. And it's very visible, in the rare cases where it's called for, especially on battlefields, because it's called for a lot on battlefields. And you can see a picture, you can visualize one right now, of somebody doing something very brave, charging the enemy, going to save a fallen colleague. That might not be courageous, because it also depends on why it was done. If it was done out of panic, or if it was done to get a medal, Aristotle says that the decisive quality of an action and its quality is if it's done for the sake of the beautiful. And that's a term of art in Aristotle and classical philosophy in general. Good is what everything is, if it is a thing. Beautiful is a high thing perfected. And Aristotle says we long for the beautiful. And one of the reasons to study Winston Churchill is to look for evidence of the beautiful. And I'm a partisan. I'm this kind of partisan. I'm a partisan after 40 years of study. And I think that Winston Churchill was a very beautiful man. The young ones here don't know this yet, but your life is going to be dominated by a series of accidents. Mine is. I was compelled to take a course in undergraduate school. I was on my way to being a lawyer. I was ambitious and full of spit and going to go to a great law school. And I was forced, against my will, to take a course in Plato, ancient political philosophy. And it just messed me up something awful. I tried to get out of it. I was a good student, and so it's a shameful thing. And I'm so grateful to a lady named Susan Power, who is the chairman of the department at Arkansas State University. I went to her and said, I don't want to take this course. I don't need it. I've done well here. Can you just hear me, young jackass, talking like that? And she said, shut up and take the course. Well, it was dominating. And I didn't go to law school. I went to graduate school. And I studied Aristotle and Plato and such, and modern political philosophy too. And I studied Abraham Lincoln and Winston Churchill. And studying Churchill was another accident. I've always had boxer dogs. We have the two worst boxer dogs in history right now. And they're both young and awful. And the first one was always getting in dogfights. And I was breaking up a dogfight, and I got bit by the enemy dog. I got a little mark right there. I can prove it. And my hand swelled up, really big, and I was bedridden. I treated it with some vet medicine that I had for my dog. And the person I was house sitting for that summer had written his doctoral thesis on Winston Churchill. And I couldn't get out of bed, and all the books were there. And so I leaned over and got one and started reading it. I've been reading it. That was in 1975, I think. And I've been reading it ever since. So it's fun. I mean, I commend it to you. It's also hard. You have to know this. Abraham Lincoln was in active politics for 8 or 9 years. Winston Churchill was in active politics for just about 50 years. And he did some very consequential things outside politics. He wrote almost 50 books. His speeches, which he wrote himself, they're published in about this wide on a shelf, tall books, closely printed, 8,000 pages. And he wrote almost, we know of 2 speeches somebody wrote for him. He didn't like it. That's more than everything we have from Abraham Lincoln, more than a lot. And since this prudence involves the circumstances, with Churchill, there's a heck of a lot of circumstances to know. And so I was young and stupid, and I fell in love with this. I can recite the first paragraph I ever read by Churchill. It's the first paragraph of one of his greatest books called The World Crisis. And I just never stopped, and I didn't realize what a difficulty I'd enrolled myself in until it was a big difficulty. I helped to write the official biography of Winston Churchill beginning in 1977. Got a fellowship, went to England, met the biographer, a great man named Sir Martin Gilbert. I met my wife in his house. She sits back there. We have 4 children and 2 grandchildren. All that comes from this dog bite. Just remember, Churchill writes in The World Crisis, he's trying to describe how to understand the First World War, which is the worst thing that ever happened until the Second World War. And he thought it was a horror, and he even predicted it was, and he fought it. Fought in the trenches in it, fought as a senior cabinet minister in it. And he says, in the second volume of that book, it's a 6-volume work, he says, huge, gigantic forces, they seem completely out of control. And they were, most of them. Nobody could stop it. Nobody could win it, really. Everybody was exhausted by it. He said, but along the pathway where footsteps are decisive, who knows when he may set a stone rolling or take or omit some seemingly ordinary step that will change everything. Now, if you think about that quote, which is one of my favorites of Churchill, there are several like it. What he's saying there is that if you can figure out where that place is, the line of commanding causation, he calls it, you could change everything. But beware, because along that line, you may just by accident set a stone rolling that changes everything. I'm going to explain that a little more next time, but art and chance are opposites, and yet they're also associates. That's why accidents are going to dominate your life, except they're not as important as what you make of them. Okay, so I started studying all that, and I have studied it now continuously since 1975, I think. I went to England. I met this very great man, Sir Martin Gilbert. He's dead now. I thought he would be like Neville Chamberlain, which is how I pictured America, a British person. In fact, he was a little Jewish guy. He's a really great guy and a man of huge capacity. And so I learned to study history with him. And then the biography, the official biography of Winston Churchill is much the longest biography ever written of anyone. There are 8 big, fat, 1,200-page narrative volumes. And then there are, I can never remember the number anymore, 31 document volumes. All the documents in the Churchill archive, which are very, very many. And Martin Gilbert eventually died, and I personally edited the last 7 of those, but I was involved in all of them. So I've been working on it for a long time. And yet I will make plenty of mistakes today. Churchill liked to say, we will not repeat the mistakes of the past. We will make new mistakes. What kind of guy was Winston Churchill? We're going to talk about Churchill's early years mostly today. They're just captivating to me, and anybody really. There's a couple of good movies made about them. They're both made out of his best early book, The River War. He also wrote a book called My Early Life, which is a good way to start. Churchill had an art that we miss painfully today, and that is he could praise himself without seeming to. He really very much does not do that unless you read closely. Nobody likes to hear long speeches about how great I am. But he was born the eldest son of the second son of a duke. And the duke is the highest rank outside the royal family. They haven't made a dukedom, a new one, except for members of the royal family, in 200 and some years now. At the end of his life, they offered one to Churchill, which he turned down. But his father was the second son of the Duke of Marlborough. And the Duke of Marlborough was the 7th, at that time, descendant of John Churchill, who, along with Wellington, is the greatest English general. He just led Louis XIV on a dance. He always won. You know, say that about almost no generals. He always won. And Churchill wrote a great book about him. And he was actually born Churchill. It was an accident. He never lived in Blenheim Palace. Blenheim Palace is one of the greatest houses in the world. And it was written to commemorate the Battle of Blenheim, which was, if memory served, in 1702. But I was confused that maybe it's 1704. And it was the decisive thing that meant that France was never going to dominate Europe fully. And it was a wonderful battle. You should read about it. Churchill's book about it is really great. He was born there because his parents were hunting. That means riding horses looking for foxes for a weekend, and his mother was hunting on a horse, and that provoked her labor, and so he was born in that place. Now, that means, by the way, that Churchill was born into the high circles of an aristocratic country. But there were 2 disadvantages that he had despite that. And one was the Duchy of Marlborough is not rich. In fact, they have to, the way great families keep their fortune together with the death duties, they call them in England the way they are, is they have to make a lot of money during their lifetime because every generation they got to pay a bunch of tax. The Duke of Westminster, related to Churchill, owns much of Mayfair, which is the sweetest part of London. They got a lot of money. They can pay the death duties. The Marlboroughs didn't have a lot of money, and that means that Churchill didn't inherit a lot of money. Some money, but not a lot. And the other thing was he didn't get a title. Being the eldest son of the second son means he wasn't Lord anybody. And so he's up there and not at the top. And that meant it was good for him, I think, because he was very energetic, and he made very great deal of money writing books. Twice in his life, he proceeded to lose most of that in the American stock market, but it was a setback. He went to school, ended up at Harrow, which is, after Eton, the most famous boys' school in England. And he was a student of mixed success. Mixed. He was not at all good at doing things that he didn't want to do. He was stubborn and distracted. He would play with soldiers for hours, learning Latin. He makes a big deal in my early life about how he couldn't learn any Latin. We have his school records. He actually did pretty well in Latin. But you can see, by the way, a democratic statesman, why would he make a big deal about the fact he couldn't learn Latin? It's kind of comfortable. I like him better knowing that. So he did pretty well in school. He took examinations to go on. He didn't do well enough to get into Oxford or Cambridge. So the military. And he didn't do well enough on the exams to go to infantry, which was cheaper for his dad, who was not rich. He got into the cavalry. His dad, who was a great politician, whose career ended in a plummet. I won't tell you that story, but it's an interesting story. His dad generally and often disapproved of Winston Churchill. That's a big thing in Churchill's life. He loved his dad. He wrote a two-volume book about his dad, Lord Randolph Churchill. I don't think the book is particularly good, and I tend to like everything Winston Churchill writes, but it's an homage. He admired him a lot. And so his dad excoriated him for not getting into the infantry. But the minute Churchill got on the back of a horse, he was happy. He just loved the military academy. He writes beautifully about it, charmingly about it, right? Nothing so good for the inside of a boy as the outside of a horse. Boys have been ruined by owning horses and by betting on horses. Never ruined by riding horses, unless they fall off, which, taken at the gallop, is a pretty good way to go. And so he was a young man, and he was in the cavalry. And now I have to tell you a little bit about the late 19th century. That's the peak of British power. And they have possessions all over the world. And the possessions all have populations and neighbors. And there are lots of fighting. And the fighting all operates on a pretty small scale. Churchill loved that. He thought that was a huge advantage. Because we get to go out and fight, not many of us are killed, and it's fun, and it makes us better people. He thought that. Churchill was really good at war. I mean, on a battlefield, he was a lethal human being, without a lot of animus. And in the cabinet rooms, when wars are going on, he was cool. He could make great things happen under pressure. But his first taste of war was in these little imperial wars. He fought in, name them. He fought first in Afghanistan, then in North Africa, in the Sudan, and then in South Africa in the Boer War. And there was a side trip in there where he was sent as a spy to observe the rebellion in Cuba. he wrote a lot about that, but he didn't write that he was a spy. It's now known that he was. The War Office sent him off there. Well, he just liked battle. The first time George Washington was exposed to gunfire, he writes in a letter, "I heard the bullets whistle, and believe me, there was something charming in the sound." Churchill wrote to his mother, "There's nothing more exhilarating than to be fired upon without effect." And he was never wounded. He was in a lot of battles, and he was never wounded. The first campaign he took part in was in Afghanistan. He wrote a book about it called The Malacan Field Force. He wrote 3 books about these wars, and each of them was a bestseller. He could write. And he was a second lieutenant. And the books would contain criticisms of generals. And they were the most famous books. His newspaper columns, for which he was paid a lot of money in those days, but significant amounts, they were one of the prime sources of information about the wars. And here's this second lieutenant, And so they passed a rule in the British Army that you couldn't write for the papers if you were a serving officer. And so what he would do is resign his commission, write a bunch of articles, and then join back up. Incredibly annoying. The great thing, there's a photograph of this scene I'll describe to you in the official biography. At one end of governing London is the Houses of Parliament and Big Ben. At the other end of the street that comes off there called Whitehall is Trafalgar Square. And if you walk from Big Ben to Trafalgar Square and look on your left, there's Downing Street. And a little ways down, look on your right, there's the War Office. It's not called that anymore, and it's now the Ministry of Defense, and it's bigger and not located all there anymore. But what it was like when it would be in the newspapers that one of these imperial wars had broken out was that there'd just be mobs of young soldiers standing around outside the War Office, hoping to catch a sight of an officer so he could plead to be sent to the war. Because there wasn't really all that much fighting. The British Army was very officer-heavy because it was made. It's a great naval power. We'll talk about that next time. It was made to have a small army that could be expanded in case of need. Well, the way to get up was to get close to the fighting. And you can just see these pictures are really great. Most of them are taken from the building next door up pretty high. And they're just a sea of these officers. Well, Churchill was not among them. He didn't do it that way. Mostly what he did was he just went to the place. And he figured out that when I get there, I'll know a lot of people, and I'll get caught on. The Malacan Field Force was a very popular book, and so he got asked by the Prince of Wales, who's the heir to the British throne, to come and talk to him about the book. And then later, about the same time, he got asked by the Prime Minister to come and talk to him about the book. And so you got the heir to the throne and the ruling executive of the nation talking to Winston Churchill about his book. And then they did what great men do when they meet ambitious young people. They said, "Anything I can do for you?" And Churchill gave the same answer to both of them. He says, "I want to go and fight in the Sudan against the Mahdi." He's really the first Islamic republic that was tearing up the British Empire. They took the capital city, Khartoum, and they beheaded George Gordon, a great British imperial figure. Chinese Gordon, they called him, because he was one of those guys he's one of the best of those guys who'd go around the world and just put an army together and fight a war and win it, usually. Well, he didn't win in the Sudan. And so everybody wanted to go to the Sudan. It was a great vengeance thing, too. I mean, because they beheaded a famous Briton in public, and you don't do that to us. Well, both the prime minister and the heir to the throne wrote to a man named Herbert Kitchener, very significant man in Churchill's life, and said, we suggest you take young Churchill. And Kitchener replied to both of them, no, I won't take him. So, that would be definitive, wouldn't it? Well, Churchill just went anyway. And it's good that he went because he wrote his best early book about that thing. And one of the two I regard there are two things that are turning points in Winston Churchill's life. And the first one is here. He watched the Battle of Omdurman. And Omdurman is a plain outside Khartoum. And, the structure of that war is that the Nile is, 1,000 miles between Alexandria at the mouth and Khartoum along the way, closer to the source. And a lot of it is impassable, shallow. And so you can't get heavy equipment down there. And so you're going to fight a desert war. And that's what got Gordon killed. There was a relief force. Herbert Kitchener was on the relief force trying to get to Khartoum to save him. And they got chopped up in the desert by these Arabs who were better at the desert than the British. It was a camel corps trying to get there, 1,000 miles. And so Kitchener was a very great logistical general. And so what he did was he loaded a bunch of equipment on boats. First, railway construction equipment. And he floated it down till the river got shallow, and he built a railway around the shallows. And then he unloaded all the cars for the railway, and he loaded up all the army and the guns and the soldiers and the horses and 2 gunboats, and he took them down the railway till the river got deep again. And then he launched them all back again. Now they've got a modern army down there. And that means the battle is over. Now, Churchill writes somewhat harshly about the regime of the Mahdi and about Islam in that book. And there are many editions of that book. And the definitive one has just been published by a friend of mine named James Muller. But some of the editions leave out some of the harshest things he says about the Muslims. And mind you, they're not racial things, right? He thought the religion at that time in his life, and much after, I think, too, that religion was not good for the people who practiced it. He thought Christianity was good for people who practiced it, unless it made them soft, which he entertained a time or two. Famous thesis from Edward Gibbon, British historian who wrote The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. And Churchill loved that book. So anyway, he doesn't like these guys, and he's in a war with them. But when he describes the decisive battle, it's they're the British. So Khartoum is up to the north a little bit. They're on the plains of Omdurman. The river is at their back, which means that they're facing west. And the dervishes, they call them dervishes, are going to charge across about a mile of open ground. And they have artillery. And the first machine guns, called Maxim guns. And when Churchill describes that, he says, the white flags, I can quote it pretty well, came over the ridge. They had no idea of the impending tragedy. They're going to kill them all before they get close. The dervishes outnumbered the British about 1.5 or 2 to 1. The dervish soldier that got closest to the British line got 100 yards away. That means couldn't see very well still, right? And And he describes the charge, and he attributes great bravery to the dervishes repeatedly in this description. And he describes what their experience. There's a paragraph, and this is, I think, is a turning point paragraph in Churchill's life. They're charging. Bullets are whistling everywhere. Horses and soldiers are screaming with pain. Dust and heat and sweat and blood. And on they come, still. When the flag goes down, somebody picks it up. Then in the same paragraph, he switches to the British line. And what's that like? Method, order. They're carrying ammunition for the guns. They're carrying water jackets to cool the barrels. After a while, the work became tedious, but they were interested in it. At each volley, there seemed to be fewer on the other end of the sight. It's a factory. Churchill hates that. He thinks that he wrote very much about this in his life. There's an essay he wrote in 1925 called "Shall We All Commit Suicide?" You have to know about Winston Churchill that he was a great warrior, and he feared war all his life. After this, and he never took it lightly. Mankind has never been in this position before. Without improving appreciably in virtue or enjoying wiser guidance, it has got into its hands at last the means of its own destruction. Death stands waiting at attention, silent, expectant, waiting for a word from the frail being, so long his servant, now for once his master. Now that I think he saw something there, and he thought, this is not about courage anymore. This is about science. But science has been changed. You know, the word science comes from the Latin, and it means to know. To be a scientist is to be somebody who knows. Technology is a different kind of word. It actually comes from the Greek word for art, techne, and it means making. And to make a thing is not the same thing as to know a thing. To know a thing is to accept the thing. See, let the thing talk to you. See what the thing is. Whereas to make a thing is to render it. And so human making has got to the place where courage doesn't matter as much on a battlefield. Who knows how to build a railroad? Who knows how to build a machine gun? Who knows how to transport them down there where they can get used? And as I say, Churchill didn't like the dervishes. He didn't like this battle. He didn't like Lord Kitchener. It wasn't his kind of general. A logistical general. The kind who throws steel at people to win. And so that was a change. Now the book was a bestseller. And after that, he goes to South Africa. And he did, at the Battle of Omdurman, he took part in the last big cavalry charge of the British Army. Because, the river's running down this way, and the British are facing that way. And in the end, the Mahdi was, the dervishes were very brave soldiers and very competent. I mean, they threw the British out of Sudan. That wasn't easy. And on the other hand, they didn't understand. And so they fought them across an open plain with all that, and they just, but then, they're not stupid, and they figure out pretty quick, we better get back to the city. And Kitchener figures out pretty quick, we got to beat them back to the city. And so now there begins a series of skirmishes where everybody is in motion. And those are fair. The only place where Churchill ascribes bravery to the British Army was during these skirmishes, in one of which he was. And he talks about there's a cavalry charge, and the desert is it undulates, but you can't see it all the time. And so they see some dervishes, and let's go get them, right? We got our horses, we got our sabers, we got our guns, we got to write them down. And they reach the dervish line, and they figure out that there's a depression, and there's a lot more of them down there in the depression. And so they charge through them, take a lot of casualties. Churchill had hurt himself getting onto a boat, messed up his shoulder, and so he was carrying a pistol. He couldn't swing a saber as well as he had been able to. And so he noticed the way these battles go. In a battle where it's a lot of people fighting directly against each other, there's a lot of brave souls who come up to attack the weak ones. So if your reins get cut or your horse is bleeding or you're bleeding, a lot of people come forward to challenge you. Whereas several times, somebody came up to him and he just shot him in the face with a pistol. Not so many came. Human nature has its ways. And anyway, he got through that, as he did everything. And you see, just think about the difference between those two stages of the battle. Because in one stage, they're not really in contact with each other. And they're working a machine. And that's different. That's not the same thing. And that means that when it took a lot of courage to win a war, there was a check on how bad war could get. And if it's technology, there may be checks. We've had decades to think about that now since the atomic bomb, which, by the way, Winston Churchill helped to invent and hated every step of the way. But it's not the same. And if Wellington would say famously that the Battle of Waterloo was won on the playing fields of Eton, right? In other words, those boys grew up playing hard games, and that was good for them, right? Hard games is not enough now. And that's some decline in the world. And there's a thing to learn about Winston Churchill. There's a lot of horrors that he predicted that it was his fate to lead his nation through. And he didn't really have much choice about that, given what he was, which was willing. He was always ready. So he learned a lot from that. And then he went down to South Africa. That was not a good war. It went on too long. The Boers, Churchill writes of that war in a book called London to Ladysmith, that he figured out while he was down there what the war was about. Because why are we fighting? We've been both living here for 300 years without fighting. Why are we fighting now? And he says around the campfire, he has a conversation with some Boers, and that they could never accept the British claim of the equality of the Kaffir, which means mostly mixed race people in South Africa, and that was what the war was about. And Churchill says Britain can't give that up. So it's a big war, and it goes on a long time, and it wasn't understood to be a universal success. Kitchener was commander in that again, and he introduced the concentration camp, which wasn't quite the same thing as what the Germans did, because those were factories for murdering people. But not a good thing, round up a bunch of people and put them in a camp. And they did that. And so he's there, and he did one very significant thing that made his political career, along with these books and other things he did. He was, by now, he was skirting the law about soldiers writing. And so he was not a soldier, he was a reporter on a given day. And a fellow named Haldane says, "I'm going to go on the armored train. Come with me." And Churchill had been on that train and didn't think it was a good idea and didn't want to go. But he was prevailed on to go. And, first of all, armored train, wouldn't that be vulnerable? And so this track that they were on went off to another town, and the track ended, so they had to come back on the same track. So everybody knew where it was going to be. And it went through a valley with rocky hills on either side, and the Boers stacked up some rocks on the track and got some artillery and machine guns and fired on the train and ran it into the rocks and derailed it. And there they are, out in the middle of nowhere, no way to go. And so the armored train is armored, and the soldiers are mostly staying in the train. And Churchill is a journalist, but he gets out of the dang train. And he walks a big circle around it, and he looks, and there's bing, 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 bullets falling, and everybody's staring, what? And he comes back and he says, "Hey, we can get this thing loose." And Haldane, who knew him, said, "Okay, have a go," right? And he recruits a bunch of people, and for about an hour they work, and they move the rocks, and they get the engineer to bump the rocks, and they get it loose. Just the locomotive, though. And so they pile up the wounded on the locomotive, and their idea is that the train's going to go slow and the soldiers are going to run behind it. But the engineer can't quite make that happen. At one point, by the way, the engineer who was wounded was just going to give up. And Churchill said to him, "Buck up, man. No one is ever wounded twice in the same battle. And now you're going to get a medal." And Churchill did put in for the medal for him. Didn't get it. And so when Churchill became a cabinet minister, later he gave him the medal. You remember things like that. Well, they couldn't make the train go slow enough, and so the men got left, and Churchill was on the locomotive. But he jumped off and said, "Well, I'm going to go with these guys." And so they get captured. And as soon as the action is over, that is to say, getting the train loose, Churchill thanks Haldane with some interesting words. He says, "Thank you for letting me do that." Now, he's been under gunfire for an hour. Several were killed. Many more wounded. He was not either killed or wounded. He said, "The whole Derbyshire Light Infantry saw that, and now I will be elected to Parliament." And he was. But he gets caught, and then they're made to march for several hours, partly in the rain. They get to another railhead, they get on another train, and they go to Pretoria, the capital. And there's a photograph of Churchill. There's a photograph of the officers dragged off this train, and they're in the middle of Pretoria, a big city, and I just love this photograph. It's in the Churchill biography. The burghers of Pretoria are lined up in a big semicircle, gawking at them. And the soldiers are kind of a bedraggled bunch off to the side. And then here's Winston Churchill, dressed somewhat differently. And he's off to the side, and I'll show you how I don't look like Winston Churchill, although I am exactly the same height he was. I guess I look like Winston Churchill later in his life. But he's standing like most of the soldiers are standing like this. Churchill is standing like this. He's defiant, except casual. It's not a big deal to him, the way it looks, right? I wrote about that one time. I said, if Hitler had seen that photograph, he might not have made the mistake of turning his back on Britain and attacking Russia. Because he just was, and then by the time he got off this train, which they were on for several hours, he'd talked to the guards who were pointing guns at him the whole time. And he'd found out a bunch of stuff. And what he found out is you're going to be taken to the state model schools, which is a semi-penitentiary, and that's where the officers are. And the enlisted men are in the stadium, sort of camping out. And so Churchill gets him to tell him how far it is between them. And so he arrives with a plan, which is to overpower the guards, march to the stadium, liberate the soldiers, take the capital, and end the war. Just the kind of thing, And the commander of the camp wouldn't do it. And so instead what he did was get away, escaped. And he just, another thing about, I said accidents. Accidents is a big thing with Churchill. He thinks that accidents and art go together, although they're opposites. See, art is what you intend to do. You do artfully. You put skill into it, right? Chances, but it's an old teaching in classical philosophy that if there's room in the universe for chance to be influential, then that means not everything is necessary. That's where art operates too. So he gets away, and he did many dumb things. He didn't have any water. He didn't have a good map. And he's exhausted. And finally, he sees a mining camp, and he goes into the camp, and he's desperate. He's got to knock on the door, and he didn't know it, but there were many houses in that camp, and there was one house in which resided British people, and that's the door he knocked on. And the guy hit him and eventually got him on a train to Mauritius, is that where it was? And he gets away. And then there are photographs of him. And this war is not going so great, and so he's a hero. And that's, he ran for office three times before he was elected. He was in many elections, and he won almost all of them, but not all of them. And he was persistent. He liked it. He liked war, although he feared it for the rest of his life. And he liked politics. He liked elections, although they were maddening for him. I have some letters that he wrote to a woman named Gladys Salmon, and she was a constituency volunteer for him in Epping, which he represented from 1924 and for the rest of his life. The constituency changed its name, but it was the same place. And I was a Rotary Fellow in England. And by chance, I was assigned to a Rotary Club in Epping. And so the Rotarians, you guys know any Rotarians? They're cool. And they adopt me. And they know that I'm interested in Churchill. So I met everybody in that place who knew Winston Churchill, which Winston Churchill represented for 40 years. And I met a lot of people. This Mrs. Salmon was the best. She was a spinster of a woman, small little lady, and very old. And she loved these memories of Churchill, and she was a good witness. That's to say, she doesn't, if you're going to tell anybody what something's like, it's a good idea not just to tell them what you think about it. Tell them what it was like. And so she was good at that. And what was going on in those years was that the Stanley Baldwin Neville Chamberlain machine in the Conservative Central Office was trying to get Churchill deselected. And that means he wouldn't have a seat in Parliament. And that meant votes in a bunch of little places spread all over the Epping district, Thaden Boys and places like that. And they had little constituency groups, and they would meet and vote. Somebody had to go to those and talk for Churchill. And the grand person who did that was Sir Stuart Mallinson, whom I met. But the great person who did it was Gladys Salmon. And she, Winston Churchill and Clementine both wrote her letters. And she would tell how exciting it was when Churchill would visit, which most of the work he didn't visit. He was busy fighting the whole government about appeasement. But she was very excited about all that, and she could tell how mostly what she related was he was kindly. Let's say he would stop and pay attention to her and grateful to her. And the letters show that too. That's the thing, a skill you should cultivate, a quality you should cultivate. And that is to say, pay attention to people. Don't do important things when you're distracted by something else. Anyway, she had these letters. And I said, these are awesome, Miss Salmon. You should leave those somewhere where they'll be preserved. And she said, I want to give them to you. And I said, no, ma'am, I don't think you should do that. I said, I think you should put them in a museum or an archive. Or you could sell them. They're worth money. And she said, would you sell them? And I said, never. And she said, that's why I want you to have them. So I have them today. I'm going to give them to the college, probably. It's got a Churchill archive. So this, if you think about this for a minute, in the formative years of his life, he's fighting and he's writing. And the writing becomes interesting. He can see things that not everybody sees. He can extrapolate. He concludes this time in his life believing that war is very dangerous, believing that Britain is very great, believing that its kindly intentions toward the people who live in it are fundamentally important, believing that that system of government, that attitude and system of government, the principles behind it, are the best thing in the world and the biggest force in the world and worth fighting to preserve, although try to keep out the fighting. Also, pretty soon in this time in his life, he begins to reflect that this technology and these destructive weapons are a natural product of free government, made by that more than anything else. Why? Because people work and innovate, they act under their own authority, they make things stronger and better. And that means that free government contains the seeds of its own destruction. just like every human thing does, right? Abject tyrannies are not particularly innovative. Yeah, but they're abject tyrannies. And free countries let people think, and that will produce strength, especially in this age of technology. And so you could say that by the time he was 27, Churchill had identified that as a force and a contradiction that he would have to deal with for the rest of his life. He had sort of completed his education by then, and that's how he got it, watching.
You mentioned 2 major turning points,
Mm-hmm.
and maybe you'll get to this eventually, but other than the Battle of Omdurman, what was the second?
He learned that the same dangers that arriving in war were arriving in peace, too. The powers that let us turn the battlefield into a technological marvel and field of slaughter can also let us control people at home. Yeah.
You mentioned a few times that Churchill liked war. And of course, war is like a tool and not an end within itself. And human beings kind of have this tendency to conflate the means with the end. And so, how do you think that Churchill guarded himself against letting his utilization of war become a glorification of it, in the same way that he divorced, like, democracy as a means from being an end within itself, the least worst kind of government? He understood it as just a tool and not the end within itself. How did he do that with war?
Okay, means and ends. Isn't that fun? Do you think that the ends justify the means? You don't? What does? Of course they do, right? I mean, don't you do something every day that you wouldn't do except for some end that's more important than that? The trouble is the relationship is more complex than that. Means and ends are in a dance of a kind. I mean, here's one of the most horrific. No, here's 2 of the most horrific associations of means and ends in human history. Let's say that you think that the Jews are an international people without state who interfere with the growth and achieving of greatness of any country. I will tell you that one of the greatest minds in the 20th century, the German philosopher Martin Heidegger, believed that. It's horrific, right? And then the next thing you know, that's an end. Let's say it's good. I don't happen to think so, but then the means adopted are to kill them all, to invent factories, to kill people. There's a wonderful movie called, what's it called? Outrage. It stars Kenneth Branagh, and it's about the Wannsee Conference, where they devised the final solution, right? Now that's a bad end and very bad means, but the ultimate end they were thinking about is that people would live in peace and harmony and grow excellence among themselves, right? Now, the other thing that's just like it is communist totalitarianism. Aristotle writes that the fundamental question in politics, or controversy in politics, is between the few rich and the many poor. So how do you handle that? Aristotle proposed a moderate way to go about it, which is rather like the way that it was adopted in the Federalist Papers, with some additional sophistications, in my opinion, in the Federalist Papers, which is you ameliorate that in various ways. A lot of it has to do with giving people a chance. But let's say instead you want to simply eliminate it. You want everybody to be the same. Well, they're not the same. And so they're not going to come out the same. But we kind of get the idea that we can make them do that. And it takes a lot of making. My wife and I have 4 children, and they're all different. You know, they're just not the same. And I think it's Penny's fault, but it's a very relentless force. So make them all the same. And that means you can't make an omelet without breaking eggs. You're going to have to kill a bunch of people. So those are bad ends and bad means. But the final end that they're after is something beyond that everybody agrees with, which is, don't we all need to live in harmony and be able to fulfill ourselves and all that stuff? And then you can see that in human life, you can't really perfectly get that, right? There isn't any, I believe, it's a long study, I believe, I argue, that the American Constitution is the best one ever written. I think that. But is it imperfect? Sure. It's for people. Bound to be. And so it's like you guys are all devoted, I imagine, to the philosopher Jack Handey. He's the Saturday Night Live philosopher. You should read him. He's really smart. I can imagine a world with no war and no weapons. And I can imagine us conquering that world because it'd be easy. It's like, that's a form, much of his humor is like this. It's a form of something that Aristotle and Thomas Jefferson and Winston Churchill all said. You can force nature out the front door with a pitchfork, but it'll be back in the back door before you can turn around. So, yeah, means and ends. It comes out there's no cookie cutter way to say the relationship exactly. Because there are some things that you just can't do. Although, if you study that, if you haven't read the Nicomachean Ethics, I suggest that you start this evening. It is one of the greatest books ever written, in my little opinion. And I've been reading it for a little longer than I've been reading Winston Churchill. And what does he tell you about that? He tells you that you have to want the beautiful. That's the thing. But then how you go about that is a prudential decision. It takes time to think of it. It takes circumstances that have to be taken into account. What will be the effect of what you do? Will it lead to greater harm? You can't perfectly know that. But yeah, so in other words, moderation is a great thing. We'll talk about it next time, but there's one time in Winston Churchill's life that I know of where he went all the way. And that's in 1940. He thought the emergency was so serious that everything should be sacrificed in order not to submit to Hitler, whether you could beat him or not. You see, you can't join that cause. It'll be the end of you. You see, well, I can tell you, he resisted doing things like that furiously all the time. And he didn't, in the end, have to do that, but nearly got close. So yeah, Churchill, he learned these things, you know. And how did he learn? Just like we learn, he could see, and he thought about it a lot. And you know, he was, by the way, he was a much better student than he ever let on. He was, I didn't come here to praise or blame Donald Trump, but he talks about himself a lot, you know, and the typical adjectives in the superlative. So I think it's kind of funny, but you won't find that in Abraham Lincoln or in Winston Churchill. He wrote an essay called "Painting as a Pastime." It's one of the most important things he ever wrote. He was a painter, you know. He had 16 solo exhibitions at the Royal Academy. Adolf Hitler, Dwight Eisenhower, George W. Bush, and Winston Churchill were statesman painters. Churchill was actually a good painter. Look at the paintings. You can see. His are interesting. And, you know, they're pretty good. Anyway, he does write a masterpiece about painting. And he says, painting is like fighting a battle, except more exciting. It's also like making a philosophic argument successfully. It's also like giving a wonderful speech. It's a work of art. And that doesn't mean it's the person who did it. It has a life of its own. And he, you know, if you notice, do you find it hard to write? It is hard to write. Very worthy, but it's very hard. And it's very hard because the minute you put a word on the page, it has a life of its own. Now, everything that comes later has to go with that word. It's why you have to start over all the time. It's why writing is a learning experience. You know, because by committing yourself, by writing this much, now you have to think what goes with that. Painting is just the same. In Painting as a Pastime, he writes a lot about the fact that he's a painter. And they're just repeated references to the fact that he's not a very good painter. There's one claim of competence in there, in the middle of this most important paragraph. And the paragraph is studying Winston Churchill, by the way, is a school of writing, because he learned how to do that. And he talked a lot about how to do it. And so one of the things he says is that, you know, before you can be eloquent, you have to be clear. Say exactly what you want to say, and learn to say it in an order that will be available to the mind of the person who says it. It's the reason it's good to have you here when most people who see this are not here. The paragraph begins, "Just to paint is great fun. The colors are lovely and delicious to squeeze out." Isn't that nice? I used to have a T-shirt with Churchill by an easel and those words. I can't find it. I can't find where to buy one anymore either. I'm going to have to devise one. Anyway, that's what the paragraph is about. Because when you write, you announce the paragraphs. And one sentence follows on the other. Unless, by the way, you want to hide something. And so he says, but then as one, I don't remember exactly the words, but it's like this, as one advances in the art, a sort of claim of competence, wider considerations come into view. One begins to see that painting a picture is like fighting a battle. If anything, more exciting than fighting it successfully. Now, hidden in a paragraph about delicious colors, he begins to talk about what it's really about. And why would he hide that, by the way? He hid that for the reader. He wants you to know, I'm not a braggart. You shouldn't be either. He wants you to know serious things hide among fun things. He's a teacher. It's very good. Anyway, then he talks about Turner, a real genius. Canvases yards wide and tall. Motion captured in an instant. Everything consistent.